Tesla's competitive advantage is actually the people that work for Tesla. It sounds very sort of business school like, but that's really what it is. It's the people, the work ethic, the innovation, the compound interest in Tesla is going to be the number of iterations that Tesla is willing to take according to our natural Sharpe ratio. In other words, the iterations normalized for errors and cost of error correction. And that is a function of the people. That is really a function of the people. So I want to talk about this today because we're 1 month into the year. So, excuse me, we have 1 month left for the year. Our performance for the year is pretty dismal. We're down more than 50% for the year. I'm going to talk about this. But I want to re-emphasize why we're long Tesla, which is our largest position. Because, again, it's the people and the competitive advantage which comes from rapid innovation. This is not even on podcast. It's December 1st, 2022. This is Krim Delco. For the day, the fund is down 40 basis points. The market is down 10 basis points. For the year, we are down 53.7%. The market is down 13.9%, while performing by 39.8%. So let's talk about Tesla as a competitive advantage. So what is the actual competitive advantage of Tesla? We talk a lot about this in different contexts. We just had a visitor from Germany, and it's interesting how people in Germany perceive Tesla as being under attack from, let's say, German competition. Now, we disagree with that. And the reason we disagree with that is not because the Germans are not capable of competing or anything like that, but there's two fundamental reasons. One is that if you're good at making ICE cars, doesn't mean you're good at electric cars. And this goes back to the scripture. When I say scripture, I mean when we talk about disruption, we really go back to the book. The book is Clayton Christensen's The Innovator's Dilemma. This is the book that is defining disruption as we use it at Orange Capital Partners. And I believe it's a very important thing to go back to the actual book, because the word has been used a lot and it's being misused all the time in the investment world. And we want to make sure we don't fall into that trap. So what Christensen is saying in The Innovator's Dilemma is that you have a company that comes up with products and services that incumbents either don't offer or don't want to offer. In both cases, they don't offer them. But the difference between not offering and not wanting to offer is you might not even know how to do it, so you're not offering it, or you could do it, but you don't care because it's a market that you're not interested in. So in both cases, what the disruptor is doing by definition is something new. And the theory of disruption is a theory of competitive response. And we use Tesla in many ways to analyze this from the scripture perspective, so from Clayton Christensen's book. And we've come to the conclusion that the reason Tesla has very little competition from incumbents is because Tesla is a classic disruptor. Tesla is in the business of luxury electric self-driving cars. That's a market that didn't exist, that the incumbents don't want to and cannot serve because they don't have the technology and they also don't have the cost structure to do it. Now, how do you actually make something happen like that? And that is where iteration comes in. And we believe that the biggest competitive advantage Tesla has is its people, because the culture in Tesla is a culture of iteration. And what we mean with that, and now we want to discuss a little bit more in detail what we mean with that. And for that, we have a tool, which is the natural Sharpe ratio. The natural Sharpe ratio is borrowed from the actual Sharpe ratio, which is defined as a measure of return normalized by volatility. I don't want to go into formulas here. It doesn't really matter. But think of like, what kind of return do you have? And by the way, it should be an excess return. So I want to also charge you a certain cost of capital, which let's say is the S&P 500. So how much more than the S&P 500 have you done? And then how do you, I divide that by volatility. Now, again, there's a lot of mathematical trickeries and things you need to be very careful of in order to really have a measure that is fundamentally useful. But let's just leave it at that. Think of it like excess return normalized by volatility. Now, we have a similar measure called the natural Sharpe ratio. The natural Sharpe ratio is discussed on January 17, 2022 for those who want to go back to that podcast. But let's just mention here there's a formula, and that is the expected natural IRR divided by the natural volatility minus the rate of minus the actual rate of cost decline of error correction. Now this sounds very complicated. Again, please go January 17, 2022. That's where we discuss it in depth. But let me just give you the sort of the intuition here. So the expected natural internal rate of return is basically how many shots on goal do you have. The more shots on goal you have, the more iteration a company has, the higher the expected internal rate of return. Now, this has to be divided by the natural volatility. So how many shots on goal do you have, but how many times do you actually miss? Meaning, if you constantly iterate, but you constantly do things that are useless, then that's pretty, that's not very good. And then we have this natural volatility minus the rate of cost decline of error correction. So if you can decline your error correction cost, then you can start making more mistakes. And if that relationship starts declining, then the whole natural Sharpe ratio goes up. This is just mathematical. So what we're trying to say here is the following. Now imagine a company like Tesla, which is continuously trying new things. The company will fail at some point in many ways, but if they can lower the cost of error correction while failing, they can keep improving much faster. Here's another example of a company that has a very bad natural Sharpe ratio. That would be a nuclear, let's say, company like Areva, which used to be a public company. That is a company that is investing in nuclear power technology. A company like that basically has sort of a 0-1 type technology. They can't iterate a lot. They have to hit it right the first time. And if they make an error, the cost of error correction is dramatic, liabilities and all of that stuff. So pretty bad natural Sharpe ratio. So what you want to invest in is a company that iterates a lot, that has hopefully very little failure while iterating, and then also that has a low cost of error correction. Now that all sounds very theoretic and nice and clean, and you can write PowerPoints, but what does it really mean? It means that you want to have a culture that iterates. This is the most important thing. Compound interest is really a function not of time but of iteration. So the more you iterate, the better you become at things, because you're trying new things. This applies to companies as much as to life. It applies to music bands, advertisements, football, soccer, whatever the more you try new things, the more the likelihood that you're going to find a niche, that you're going to find something nobody else is doing, and you're going to become more competitive. And that's exactly what Tesla is doing. That's why we believe that Tesla has very little competition. And that's why we believe that the incumbents cannot compete with Tesla. Now, having said that, there's two questions here. One is, why are we so sure that Tesla doesn't have competition? Because Tesla doesn't have a monopoly on iteration or on increasing the natural Sharpe ratio. And there is actually a place where that natural Sharpe ratio tends to be pretty high also, and that's China. China has a culture of iteration. China has a culture of being ready to fail. And China also has a culture of reducing the cost of error correction. Now that's the last part is where China, from our point of view, is not as good as Tesla. In other words, they tend to fail and then really blow up. So let's say they iterate photovoltaics, and then the whole thing blows up, or what they did with Bitcoin, they iterate, became the best Bitcoin miners in the world, and then they blew up. It's often because the government is sort of orthogonal to freedom and growth and wealth creation. That's a problem in China that unfortunately is accentuating itself right now, where we see that the government is really not interested in freedom as a wealth creating source, as a source of wealth creation. The government wants wealth creation without freedom. Now that doesn't work, because iteration, intellectual freedom, all of these things are related. And therefore we believe that the risk, and my point, the reason I'm talking about China is we always thought the main risk comes from China. And with this Mao 2.0 movement now in China, we believe that risk is less. It's still there, but it's less. The other question that we have is now, how come Tesla is so good, and let's say Mercedes, Daimler, BMW, Renault, whatever, Toyota, they're not that good? And that's, let's go back to the scripture. That is Clayton Christensen, because it's the companies that I just mentioned, they have success in certain areas. Those are their markets. Very competitive markets, very little cost, very little profit, and an incredibly low natural Sharpe ratio, because the expected internal rate of return is very little. Now the volatility is also very little, but meaning they don't make that many mistakes because they don't iterate much. But everything is very low. It's a very low energy type space, if you want. And Tesla is a very high energy type space. Lots of iteration, lots of things going on, lots of energy, and therefore also lots of internal rate of return. So to summarize, this episode is really meant to start. We're going to have more sort of backward-looking episodes now, just because we're getting towards the end of the year, and we're going to discuss what happened this year and why we did what we did. We have a pretty bad performance. And the main reason, of course, is macro. There's some issues with Tesla and Twitter in particular, and there's some issues with China. But what we wanted to do in this particular episode is really focus on why Tesla is such a strong company. It's because of the people's willingness to iterate, which means work hard, put energy into new ideas, new things, reduce the errors, and reduce the cost of error correction, which is the source of compound return. Thank you.